You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm joined by Diane Rovner, a former food magazine editor, food tour guide, and founder of Bordeaux in Bites. She's here to discuss the history and evolution of the French cultural approach to food, whether it comes to quantity or quality, as she helps us navigate Gourmet. I am so excited to welcome you to the podcast, Diane. We've been colleagues for a while. We love talking about food, and you have a really interesting background in food and in your life here in France. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and where you come from?
Oh, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Emily, for inviting me on your lovely program. I'm excited to talk to you and your listeners about life and about my life in particular. So yes, my name's Diane Rovner, and very briefly, I'm the owner of a food tour company in Bordeaux called Bordeaux in Bites. And my background actually does span different countries and different industries, starting with working at the late great Gourmet magazine back in the day in New York, doing food tours in Paris, and now being based in the Southwest.
Amazing. And the late great Gourmet magazine is, part of what I am excited to talk to you about, because this word that we're going to try and suss out together today is one of my absolute favorites in French because it really doesn't have a great translation. And that's this word gourmand. And, you have been living here in France, I think even longer than I have. And, over time living in France, interacting with French people, there are these words that you're like, I wish we had a way to say that. And gourmand is a word that I feel lacks an adequate translation, but I feel like it's often kind of compared with gourmet, but there is a big difference. So from your perspective right off the bat, do you intuit like a difference in connotation and in meaning between when someone says that they're a gourmand versus when someone says that they're a gourmet in French?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question to start off with because, technically, gourmand in French is supposed to mean glutton or, somebody who's actually greedy. So I think there's a negative connotation that's sometimes associated with it, sometimes pejorative. And then gourmet, I think, is usually what people are trying to describe when they mean that they are very interested in food, very curious about it, into fine wine and dining perhaps. But yeah, I do feel that people often get them a bit confused, even in French.
Yeah. And I think one thing I love about the word gourmand in French specifically is that, like you said, it is this translation for glutton. And I see people often saying greedy as a translation, but I feel like the negative connotation of greedy in English isn't quite as strong with gourmand. Like you can have like one of my favorite ways to use the word gourmand is actually in like a modified term, which is gourmandise. And it's like when people offer you like a slice of cake at the end of a meal and you're like, I'm full, I'm sated, but par gourmandise, yes, I will have some cake. And it's not like you're being actually greedy. It's not like there's not that like sort of sense of almost overwhelming excess that there is with gluttony. It's kind of like, this is going to feed a different kind of hunger. It's going to feed like my pleasure hunger, but not like my stomach hunger.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's a much more appropriate way to describe the nuance.
So, with that in mind, do you think that French people would be like proud or embarrassed to say that they're a gourmand?
Oh gosh, to be really honest, I don't know many people who use that word in a positive way. And again, maybe it's just the people I know or I associate with, but I would say in general, I think I wouldn't use the word, being embarrassed or attaching shame to it, but it's not usually something I think that I would say is said with any pride, simply because I think part of why, you always hear that question of like, oh, why are French people so thin? And I think it's because they live in a country, or we live in a country where there is a lot of, perceived gluttony, but then there's a lot of course correction like immediately after.
Ooh, okay. Tell me about that. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, so many times I've been with my husband's family or, friends' families or whatever. So they'll have these like enormous decadent meals, the kind you dream about in France. And then, at some point in the conversation, or definitely the next day, it's like, oh, well, we just had all of that food. So now we're going to have, some lighter things today, some salads, etc. And so there's much more of this idea of let's balance all of these things that we've just ingested versus, again, coming from the States where it's like, we don't course correct. It's, we like to eat this thing. It's delicious. I'm just going to keep eating it like every day. So it's a very different way of looking at food. I pointed this out recently because even my husband didn't notice, but if you're ever in the metro in Paris and food advertisement in France in general, by law has these small little sentences at the end, or at the very bottom that says something like, oh, exercise regularly, or eat fruits and vegetables every day. Or have you seen those, Emily? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Totally. And like, I always make fun of those on my tours, like the fact that whenever they advertise snack food in France, there's always that little like disclaimer at the end that reminds me of when they used to advertise cigarettes on television, which is like snack in moderation. Like,
Exactly.
Like a snack is a little bit scary.
Exactly. So I think it's kind of funny, again, to live in a country that's so known for food, but in many ways has built into the culture the idea of balance, moderation, pacing, if you will. And so I think going back to your question, gourmand, like I said, I don't want to entirely slate it as a negative word, but I personally don't know people who use it positively, I would say.
I would agree with you. And I think it's like maybe neutral to slightly negative, whereas glutton in English is very negative. So maybe what I'm noticing is like a sliding scale rather than the fact like that it's actually positive. But it's not this sort of thing that you would self-flagellate about in the way that you might say in English, like, oh my God, I was so bad yesterday because I ate cake. It's more of those slight, like what you were describing, these slight corrections. I still remember reading in like a French women's magazine. I was like sitting in a doctor's office waiting room, and it was like menu après fête. And it was like in the morning, like have a yogurt and a piece of fruit. For lunch, have like this soup. And like, it wasn't like about doing a cleanse and starving yourself the next day. It was like, you ate a lot of foie gras yesterday, so today maybe eat a vegetable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so we have this like idea of a gourmand, which I think to a certain extent is linked to like the quantity of food that you eat. But then we have this word gourmet. And gourmet, obviously, we've borrowed into English. We have the word gourmet. We use the word gourmet, I think, in English often as like an adjective. Like we say like, a gourmet something. But in French, you also have like the gourmet, the person. Do you feel like a gourmet in French is like a foodie? Is it like a quality driven thing? And is that something to be proud of?
Oh gosh. Yeah. I think I would say in a very different context, it's a very positive thing. So kind of like what you're accurately saying, using it as an adjective, I feel like it's used more to reflect something of high quality, something really above average, if not excellent, and something definitely to be proud of as well. So if it was, a person, then obviously it would be somebody who's interested in, such foods or, a lifestyle, if you will. But using it as an adjective, like a gourmet meal, definitely. I think that that's meant to be reflective of, just that it's really, truly exceptional.
And in France, do you feel like that's the most apt sort of translation for the word foodie? Or is it different?
I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, and foodies is such a funny word too, because, don't get me started. I meet so many people when I'll say to them, oh, so you're a foodie, and they just vehemently like do not like that word for whatever connotation they've put on. I think that's the funny thing about language in general, and why I appreciate, these conversations you like to have, is because there's, I think, the dictionary definition of what a word is, kind of like what we were talking about with gourmand, but then there's this sort of like subtle contextual definitions we put on it that are really more, social constructs, or just how it's gotten kind of used and thrown around over time. So yeah, is gourmet a foodie? Oh, yeah, I would say so. I don't know if there's an exact equivalent to foodie in French, to be honest. So I would say gourmet would be the closest.
Yeah, well, I mean, if there isn't an exact translation, I wonder if it's because we conceive of, an interest in food in different ways in both countries. Like, I feel like obviously you and I have both noticed in recent years, being interested in food, being excited about learning more about food, about where your food comes from, is kind of on the rise in both countries. But I'm curious if you've noticed a difference in the way that French people sort of conceive of their interest or relationship to food. Let's, for the sake of this argument, say we're talking about people who are interested in food, because obviously in both America and France, there are people who couldn't care less. But
Sure.
If you are into food in France or in the US, do you feel like the way in which we engage with food, like intellectually, or even like in the preparation and the time and money we're going to spend on food, is it the same? Or do you notice some major differences between the way that like French foodies or French gourmets and American foodies or American gourmets engage with their food?
Oh, 100%.
Okay.
So I, again, like you, having kind of this access and sort of cultural perspective on both countries, it's really fascinating to compare the two. So I remember growing up in the US before the Food Network. And so the idea of, being interested in food, I feel like was a cultural shift in the US that I think became much more intensified with, again, the rise of things like the Food Network, leisurely and casually watching people cook on TV.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, now in the day and age of social media and Instagram. So I think in the US, and I lived in New York as well, too. So I feel that our interest and relationship with, higher quality food is, I would say, much more, and again, I'm hesitant to use this word, but sort of associated with an elitism, right? So it's like, if you have the money to go to such restaurants, and again, I'm talking about my perspective living in New York, it was a luxury. Or again, if you had the money to eat out at these places all the time, then again, you were considered very wealthy. Even I think when I go back home these days, it's like, oh, I only shop at Whole Foods. And that's associated with a certain lifestyle and a certain income level, we'll say. Whereas, pre all of that, it was like, we would all go to the same supermarkets. It would be fine. Your mom would cook whatever. You would eat whatever school lunches, and it was all fine. And so I think that's why I do get that reaction every now and then when people are like, oh, no, I'm not a foodie. Because there's a certain, again, elitism that can be sort of associated with that. Whereas in France, I feel it's completely different where, one, you're living in a country the size of Texas, right? And so you have a much smaller population to feed. And by its very nature, less industrialization. And so I think because of that, all the French people I know, including my husband, grew up with very high quality food from the beginning, in their household. They had a farmer that was local that they would get, their beef from or their vegetables from. I think even in cities like Paris, we have regular farmers markets at least once, if not twice a week in our neighborhoods. So the access to really high quality foods is very normalized, and it's not associated with, I'm going to go to Whole Foods or I'm going to pay more money to access this. It's very equalized. It's very democratic. And I think restaurants as well, too. The French are really lucky that they have this incredible history of great ingredients, great recipes, great traditions, great techniques that they just grew up eating. And so, yeah, of course you can eat, low quality meals, low quality food. It's of course everywhere. but I feel like the relationship with better quality food has just always been intrinsically in the culture. And I feel like if there is any kind of shift towards, being more of a foodie, I think it's because of social media. It's because of Instagram driving like, oh, we need to go try this new restaurant. We need to go eat this new thing. In the 10 years I've been here, what I've seen more and more about the changing habits of French food culture is, I hate to say it's becoming more American.
Mm-hmm.
So I sort of joke about this with people on my tours of like, oh, you're going to see a lot more like American style cookies and carrot cake and banana bread. And, I hate to say like more fast food chains coming in as well too. And people actually being kind of excited about it because it's different for them.
Totally.
If you've grown up eating, macaron all of your life and croissants all of your life, it's kind of cool to be like, oh, I'm now going to go and eat babka,
If you're enjoying this podcast, you may enjoy our sister podcast, City of Muses. Each week, join City of Muses host Jennifer Garrity as she sits down with contemporary artists, dancers, and performers to explore what inspires them, where their ideas come from, and how Paris has helped or hindered their dreams come true. Inspiration and creativity meet in Paris, the City of Muses. Check out City of Muses now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. I mean, I love that you brought this up because I feel like part of the sadistic pleasure I get out of this podcast is in breaking people's images of France, because I think obviously there's some truth to this, image we have, but you need to take off the rose-colored glasses, and everybody thinks, everyone grew up learning how to make coq au vin at their mother's knee No, a lot of French people, shop at Picard, which makes frozen food. A lot of French people don't know how to cook or aren't interested in cooking. And there has been, I think maybe, I don't know how you feel about this, but my impression is that maybe the French didn't necessarily become quite as disjointed from their food system as the Americans did. So the pendulum shift had less, what hadn't swung so far towards industrialization as it did. And so the swing back is a little less intense and less pronounced. And I think the same is true when you were talking earlier about our approach to, the healthy eating after we feel like we've indulged. We're both going to make corrections, but the corrections in France will be a little more subtle. Mm-hmm. But here I'm definitely seeing social media is driving a lot of changes in France. Food TV, Top Chef is really popular in France, and all these Top Chef winners are opening their brand new restaurants, and there's a little bit of a status searching for, you have to get to that new restaurant right away, that kind of thing. So, it's not completely dissimilar. It's not as though everybody in France is still making grandma's old-fashioned French recipe every single day and taking 2 hours for lunch.
Yeah, that's completely true. And I think since I'm in Paris at the moment as we're speaking, but what I've seen more and more that people get excited about is, and again, I hate to use this word, but what I'd call fusion food, right? I'm sure you've seen this too, where it's like, let's go try this new restaurant where the chef is from fill in the blank country, whether it's Japan, whether it's the Philippines, and this is their take on French food. And I think as a French person, again, it's super exciting to have this exposure to other cultures, to, seeing your cuisine, I think, shift in really interesting ways. And I think in many good ways, for sure. But those are the kinds of trends that I'm noting now. It's less and less, let's stick with tradition. It's becoming more experimental.
Yeah. And so you now design and run food tours in Bordeaux, which I think is an interesting place to be working because it's a vibrant place. There's a lot of innovation there, which I know we've spoken about before, but it's also a lot smaller than Paris. So maybe you get like a little bit more of a distilled image of sort of what's happening. I'm curious, sort of double-pronged question here. What elements of the food scene in Bordeaux do you get the most excited to share with visitors? And if it's different, what elements of the food scene do you think that your guests are most excited to discover?
Okay, yeah. That's a great double-pronged question. Okay, so the first part of your question, which I'll distill as, how is Bordeaux different than Paris, more or less? Kind of the way I was just describing how I think I should say Parisians are excited about fusion, again, for lack of a better word. And most of the restaurants and trends are about trying this new take on French food. What I love about Bordeaux and what I tell visitors is here's kind of a playground where you get the same excellent products, the same excellent techniques, the same, people who are passionate about food, but who get to be creative in a city where the stakes are much lower. So I think the result is way more interesting, to be really honest. Again, I'm not trying to knock Paris at all, but I just, it's
Paris doesn't need any more. Paris is fine.
Thanks. But I feel like, again, imagine Paris would be like New York, right? Where it's, again, if you're trying to open up a small business or restaurant, the stakes are so much higher because, the rents are so extremely high for your country. The spaces are tiny, etc. And then people come to Bordeaux and then it's like, oh, I can do whatever I want, And it's just been so interesting to see how that's developed, especially in the last 5 years, I really have to say. So I think just to give your listeners a bit of context, oh God, I'm blanking on the date, but I want to say something like 2016, 2017. In France, there was a high-speed train that connected Paris and Bordeaux in just 2 hours. So that kicked off this massive, not so massive, but like a shift in people moving down to the Southwest and saying, we have a much higher quality of life with pretty much all the benefits of Paris. So, and I know you and I have talked about like if Bordeaux is kind of a mini version of Paris, I would say yes, in a good way. And so I think, again, the result is you have all these people who are super excited to, explore their own creativity in Bordeaux, in this really great city. And so the trends I would say I see there are people who are less dealing with fusion, but more on par with experimenting with French ingredients. And I think that actually is really, really exciting to me. So because you have an entire country of regional French products, and I'm not just talking about, okay, you have like the French Basque region, which not a lot of people are familiar with, but you have like Piment de Splet, you have like all these great products and things that are grown specifically in the Southwest region. But a lot of people don't know that there is a beer culture in France, and more people have started up their own breweries. So one of the cheese shops I love, the guy actually has an insane collection of beers, and he wants to encourage you to do a beer and cheese pairing, which would be unheard of in France. And they're mostly French beers. So, this is the kind of stuff that I really like introducing to people to say, like, look, you don't always have to turn outward for inspiration. You can actually turn inward and, look at the results of that. So the places we go to are really, really exceptional on our tours, of course. But to the second part of your question, I think the people we get on our tours, one, I think they're really excited to discover Bordeaux itself. And Bordeaux is very much under the radar in a lot of ways. And I say that only because I've met a lot of people who land in Bordeaux and immediately rent a car and drive out to one of the local vineyards. And so they kind of sidestep Bordeaux as a city almost entirely, which I think is such a shame because, as I said, like it's really transitioned, especially in the last 5 years. I think they're also really excited, and I'm excited for them to discover things from the Southwest. So again, not a lot of people really get exposed to how distinct food from the Southwest is or the regional differences. And so that is something that I think we showcase for sure, starting with cheeses, for example. So there's a number of cheeses you can't find in other parts of France that are only available in the Southwest. A number of other products that come from the Southwest that are just really excellent there. And people don't realize that it's such an amalgam that's more than just wine, right? So you've got like oysters from the Bay of Arcachon. You have, again, the French Basque region, which I mentioned. So we actually include Gâteau Basque, which a lot of people have never tried. The cheeses I mentioned, which are excellent. Most of them are sheep's milk cheeses, typically. the, foie gras and, related duck products that are all based in the Southwest. Yeah, they're just exceptional. And so, yeah, I get excited exploring those variations with people. And I think as a result, they get excited through our tours.
That's awesome. If you suddenly got a request and it was French people coming on one of your tours in Bordeaux, is there anything that you would change about the way that you approach these elements of the scene that so excite you so that it would sort of better suit a French audience? Or do you feel like the things that you're excited about would also excite a French person?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually wouldn't change anything. Usually we have had French people on tours before, so they're coming from other parts of France. So again, they're not as familiar with some of these regional distinctions that we were just talking about. But again, I think they would be really excited to see the innovation that I was just talking about. So the idea of like, oh, we've got like French beer, let's pair that with different things. Or, again, like let's learn how our own products are being used in a more contemporary way. So yeah, I think French people would get a lot out of it as well.
Okay. So they're not, again, we're trying to break with stereotypes here. And I was just sort of curious to see, do you think that the French are more likely to want to protect tradition, or are they, for the most part, welcoming of these sort of innovations that you've been talking about?
Oh, I guess it depends on the kind of French person, right?
That's true. That's fair.
So maybe if they were older, they might have more attachment to the tradition. I think younger French people, because they're so open to all these new different experiences and inspirations, I think they would be psyched for it. But yeah, it I would say it depends on the person.
Totally. I know whenever I ask questions like this, we're always being forced to overgeneralize. And like I recently was organizing a cheese and wine tasting, and I love cheese and beer tastings, by the way. I think that's awesome. But I was organizing a cheese and wine tasting, and I went to the local cooperative, in the south of France, and asked for a bottle of crémant to go with some of the cheeses. And everybody in the room was like, well, because they were all French, sort of aghast. They were like, oh no, that's more of an aperitif. And I was like, yeah, I know. But also it's delicious with cheese. And I think sometimes people are willing to just sort of try it. And to be fair, 4 of the people on the tasting were French, and they were like, oh, that's really interesting. I never would have thought to do that. But a lot of people, I think, do kind of bulk, especially when you or I don't know about you, but for me, when I am a foreigner and I'm saying, what if you tried your traditional food this way? And a lot of the time I get sort of that like, oh, you can't touch that. It's almost sacred. But I think it depends on maybe the generation and the French person. And
I think it also, and maybe it's just the French people I know, but it depends on the generation. I think it also depends a bit on who is suggesting it. So if it's quote unquote an expert, like you or me or another, highly respected French trained chef, then they'd be like, oh, okay. But if it was just like, average Joe on the street who's like, oh, you should try this, I think people are a little more skeptical. Or, technically, since I'm American, I also get some of that skepticism as well, too. But one of the guides that works with me, Alexandre, who is obviously French, he'll say it and people are like, oh, okay, that's so good.
That's really interesting.
So it could be a little bit of that as well.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Romancing in Paris, which delves into love, lust, and so much more in the City of Light. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
You've kind of jokingly said before that like the French want to be told what to like. If I'm
yeah, that's true. That's my understanding anyway. But you're right. It does matter who's doing the telling, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
And they like a bit of, I think they like to be told what they like because they like to engage with it. So they're like, tell me what I should like so that I can argue with you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's, those are some of the conversations I have with our vendors, to be really, really honest. So again, on a typical tour, we're not forcing you to do, for example, beer and cheese. That's just a nice option, and I think a really unique option. The conversations that I'll have with David will be like, oh, he gets such resistance from other French people. And it's because he's in Bordeaux, first of all, obviously. But, you still have a lot of traditional ways of thinking. And I've met other, sommeliers and cavistes, wine shop managers who will say, oh, you only have cheese with light red wine. Like they have their kinds of things that they sort of stick to. Or, a really common thing that they do in the French Basque region, which I learned living in Biarritz, was, pairing cheeses with a black cherry jam. And so those are things that you don't see in other parts of France, but, they do exist. And then when you try them, they're delicious. And then people are like, oh, okay. I'm really, really delighted that I tried that.
Yeah. That's awesome. So where can people find you? How can people come and take one of your amazing tours in Bordeaux?
Why, thank you for asking, Emily. The best way is to go to the website. So BordeauxInBites.com. It's Bordeaux, the city, in bites. And yeah, we would love to welcome any and all of you to take a tour with us.
And do you do typically private tours, small group tours? What do they look like if somebody joins one of your tours?
Okay. So another great question. They're generally small group tours. Max is 8 people to keep it nice and cozy. And what's really nice is that they're as personalized as possible. So the thing I always want to impress upon people is it's not a factory experience. We don't get exactly the same things every single time. It's really, what you're curious about trying. I or the guides will gauge, your interest level in certain things or what you're curious about. And we can kind of lean into that more or steer away from, other things based on what you guys want to try. But I think it keeps it really, keeps it fresh. And again, makes it a more memorable experience for you because you didn't travel all the way to eat, brie, right? So we want to get you things that you're actually like interested in trying. But yeah, it's a small group tour, and they're a lot of fun, and they end in a wine shop. So who doesn't love that?
Yeah, exactly. Who does not want to do that? Well, for anyone who wants to join a Bordeaux in Bites tour, we will put a link to the website in the show notes, so you can feel free to click on that, get in touch with Diane and her fantastic team on the ground there in Bordeaux, and ask her even more about Gourmet and Gourmet and all elements of French food culture. She will definitely hook you up. Diane, thank you so much for joining me today. It has been so fun. Before I let you go, I just have one last question for you, and that is, what is your favorite word in French? Put you on the spot there.
Wow, I was so thrown. I was not expecting it. I'm just gonna first word coming to my head.
Yeah.
Affineur.
Ooh, I like that one.
We don't really have the equivalent in English. And for those of you who don't know, so if you go to a cheese affineur, it's somebody who ages their own cheese. But I don't know. I think it's a cool word.
It is a cool word. I like that. Amazing. Well, maybe you'll get a chance to visit an affineur if you go on a Bordeaux in Bites tour.
Come to Bordeaux.
Go to Bordeaux. Go to Bordeaux. It's great. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Emily.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.